The coast was gray, forlorn, and abandoned. Quite literally post-apocalyptic. Other than a single lonely ship floating in the frigid waters, there were few signs of human life. Everything was quiet and still except for the sea. This was Massachusetts in November of 1620, a year after the convening of the First General Assembly in Virginia. This ship, the Mayflower, had on board 102 passengers and 2 dogs, divided into 2 groups, adventurers and religious separatists known to us as the Pilgrims. They were far from where they were supposed to be. They had planned to settle along the Hudson River near where New York City would be founded, but storms had prevented them from sailing any further south. Now, with winter setting in, they were stranded here, all on their own, some 500 miles north of Jamestown. The colonists faced many difficult decisions. Most immediately, they had to decide how they were to be governed. The old arrangements they'd worked out didn't apply to this situation. They had no charter from the king to settle in this land, and no instructions to deal with this eventuality. Their fate was in their own hands. Could they hold things together, or would the 2 groups split, to the detriment of both? Thankfully for them, an agreement was reached. They drafted a charter themselves, a social contract forming themselves into a new government on their own authority. This was the Mayflower Compact. It read in full, quote, "In the name of God, Amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken, for the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for a better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James, of England, France, and Ireland the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, 1620. The compact was signed by 41 of the male colonists on board. Just like that, they had made themselves into a government. And so it is here, below decks on the Mayflower, stranded in uncharted territory with winter fast approaching, that we begin the story of self-government in New England. Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 9, The Coming of the Pilgrims into a State of Nature. The last 8 episodes of this podcast were all about the first 60 years of English settlement in Virginia and then Maryland. We saw both colonies endure trial after trial, sometimes just surviving by the skin of their collective teeth. But they had figured out a workable model of governance, with the lower house of the legislature being elected and everyone else being appointed. The right to vote was eventually restricted to just landowning men, with landless freemen, servants, and a growing number of slaves all excluded from power entirely. For better or for worse, the Chesapeake had figured out what sort of society it was going to be. But now we're going to jump back in time over 50 years to tell the story of New England, a very, very, very different sort of society. The story of American colonization is as much a story of harbors and bays as anything. Virginia and Maryland were both founded to take advantage of the Chesapeake Bay's superb waterways. Philadelphia was founded near the mouth of the Delaware Bay. The Dutch settled around New York Harbor. North and South Carolina were both centered around protected harbors and lagoons. Each of these colonies was created to take advantage of the natural geography of the Atlantic coast, with safety for shipping being one of the highest priorities. As a result, settlement of the eastern seaboard was highly scattered, with each region serving as the nucleus for its own small society. Each society had its own culture, contingent both on the culture of those who had settled there and the economic needs of colonization. While New England doesn't have one big harbor, it has lots of smaller ones, scattered up and down the coast. Portsmouth Harbor, Massachusetts Bay, Cape Cod Bay, Rhode Island Sound, Long Island Sound. Little colonies would pop up at each of these. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and others that didn't survive for long. Although these colonies would feud, they had one very important thing in common, a history of religious dissent. Every one of these colonies other than New Hampshire was founded by religious dissidents of one kind or another, generally Puritans. These settlers left the old world for the new in order to worship as they pleased, though as a rule they believed in freedom only for their own beliefs, not for those of other dissenters. But before we get to that, we need to go back to the beginning to explore in more depth the origins of religious dissent in England, to understand why those few dozen pilgrims found it so essential to flee England for Holland and then Holland for America. You'll recall from episode 2 that England had become Protestant in an unusual way. England split away from the Catholic Church not out of any real religious convictions, but because it was the best way for Henry VIII to leave his wife, and to seize valuable church lands. There were die-hard Protestants in England, sure, but they were rarely in charge of religious policy. After some unrest, things settled down under the decades-long reign of Elizabeth in the late 1500s. She was by conviction a very moderate and cautious Protestant. She wanted to keep England's church out of the Pope's control, but she was happy to maintain lots of Catholic practices. While other Protestants on the continent and in Scotland were busy radically simplifying Christianity, Elizabeth kept much of the ornateness of the old church. This compromise left a lot of people unhappy. Many in England had become true believers in Protestantism, and they wanted the reforms to go much further. These reformists were generally known as the Puritans. There was no one Puritanism, no one set of doctrines, and no clear boundaries between the Puritans and everyone else. They were just the men and women on one side of the debate. For the most part, they remained loyal to the Church of England, since the Church was reasonably open to them, even though their views didn't predominate. It's easy to stereotype the Puritans, to see them as harsh and humorless disciplinarians, uncompromising, witch-burning religious fanatics. H. L. Mencken famously defined Puritanism as, quote, the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, may be happy. And frankly, there's definitely some truth to the stereotypes, even if they are exaggerated. They were religious extremists, and that permeated every aspect of their lives. But obviously there's more to it than that. The Puritan worldview is a complex one. There are a few main distinctive Puritan beliefs worth talking about. Puritans, being Calvinists, believed in the doctrine of predestination, which said that God had already decided even before birth the identities of the few people who would be saved and enter heaven after death. All the rest of humanity was hopelessly damned, but there was no certain way to know which group you belonged to. This produced in the Puritans an often severe anxiety about their status and spurred them to greater levels of piety and sobriety, that they might reassure themselves that they were likely among the saved. Partly, this piety involved going back to the basics of Christianity, and that meant going back to the Bible. Every religious tradition that had developed over the last 1500 years was to be cast aside unless it had explicit biblical sanction. So the Catholic-style rituals and the Catholic-style hierarchy of the Anglican Church all had to go. Believers needed to return to the simple purity of the earliest church, or at least the earliest church as the Puritans understood it. But the Puritans weren't just out to destroy, they wanted to build something new. They wanted to replace the old, indirect, and intermediated relationship with God with a direct relationship. They wanted Christians to experience and understand God themselves, without priests or anything else getting in the way. They still believed in ministers, of course, they just didn't believe that ministers were separate from society in the way that an ordained Catholic priest was. They were there to guide and to teach. Ministers were to be selected by each congregation rather than assigned by a centralized authority, just as they believed it happened in the early years of Christianity. Each congregation was then, in a sense, sovereign. This local self-rule would be a model for secular government in New England as well. And Puritans were fundamentalists who believed that reading and understanding the Bible was the foundation of their relationship with God. The Catholic Church at this point was still concerned about letting people read the Bible in the vernacular, but Puritans embraced it with gusto. The study of God's Word was essential. You had to read the words yourself to truly understand and interpret them. This attitude also had the side effect of promoting literacy in general among Puritans. Which isn't to say that Puritans were just academic in their faith. They had the intense passion of modern evangelicals, of the newly converted. Of course, this sort of intensely personal attitude towards religion meant that splits over doctrine were common. Everyone was convinced that they knew the truth, and that the slightest wavering could mean damnation. For instance, the Pilgrims, who we're going to be talking about today, were a very distinct group within Puritanism. Arguably, they weren't even Puritans at all. What's the difference, you ask? Aren't those basically different words for the same thing? For the same dour, grim, all-black-wearing, witch-trial-having zealot? Well, not quite. The Pilgrims and the Puritans were very similar groups, motivated by the same sorts of impulses and convictions, but the Pilgrims were more radical. And also the Puritans mostly didn't wear black. They merely dressed as drably as possible. But specifically, the Pilgrims were Brownists, followers of the teachings of one Robert Brown. The Brownists were part of the extreme fringe most hostile to the Church of England. While most Puritans remained loyal to the church and hoped to reform it from within, the Pilgrims believed that the church was beyond hope, and so they had separated from it altogether. Because of their radical nature, the Pilgrims were the first to see America as a potential refuge, but it also meant that they were few in number. The colony they founded at Plymouth was never very successful. When the Puritans founded Massachusetts Bay Colony a decade later, they came in far greater numbers. By the end of the century, they absorbed Plymouth Colony and the Pilgrims altogether. So I'll be talking more about the Puritans than the Pilgrims overall, but the Pilgrims came first, so here we are. To break away from the established church to worship on your own, as the Brownists did, was an illegal act, one seen as highly threatening to public order. So they were persecuted, and in 1608, a few hundred separatists left England for the Dutch Republic, which was at the time a haven for religious toleration. They spent a few years there, but this proved unsatisfactory as well. Work was scarce, and their children were absorbing Dutch culture rather than the austere Puritanism of their parents. They realized that without changes, their community would soon dissipate. So some of the saints, that's what they called themselves, decided that Holland wasn't nearly isolated enough. They needed to go to America. They entertained several offers, including one by the Dutch to settle them in New Netherland, but they eventually decided on Virginia. In the 1610s, this was still an extremely risky proposition. Jamestown was still in a state of martial law, and the death rate was still atrocious. In 1618, a similar group of religious separatists had sailed for Virginia, but of the 180 passengers, 130 had died at sea during the crossing. So, other than faith in God, there was really no reason for them to believe that they were doing anything but heading for their deaths. But they were true believers, and so they worked out a deal with the Virginia Company. Edwin Sands, the man responsible for the creation of Virginia's General Assembly, was also instrumental in getting approval for the Pilgrims to migrate. This was in the late 1610s, right when the Virginia Company was overhauling the management of its colony, trying to move away from martial law and the command economy in order to attract more migrants. So the company was more than willing to make concessions to the separatists, including special grants of religious toleration. Anything to get more bodies to Virginia. The king refused to grant the Pilgrims official freedom of worship in America, but he did assure them that they would be left alone in practice. But negotiations dragged on for several years, thanks to internal turmoil in the Virginia Company. Finally, in 1619, everything was settled. However, before the Pilgrims could set off, a merchant named Thomas Weston came to them with a more enticing offer. Instead of Virginia, why not settle in New England? Weston represented a new company attempting to colonize New England, and he wanted the Pilgrims to be their first colonists. By New England, he meant what we would call New York, which was considered part of the larger area of New England at the time. The terms he offered were favorable. The Pilgrims and the merchants would together form a joint stock company, a bit like the Virginia Company. The merchants would contribute funds and the Pilgrims would contribute their labor, and all would be given a share of the profits. New England wasn't totally unknown to Europeans at this point. Fishermen and fur traders sometimes went there, and after his time as governor of Jamestown, Captain John Smith had returned to America and charted the New England coast, and even coined the name New England. In fact, at one point, the Pilgrims approached John Smith about joining their expedition, but they later changed their minds. But as you can see, New England was still much less known than Virginia. However, if anything, that was a plus to the Pilgrims, who feared being harassed or losing their identity if they lived as a part of any larger community. It seemed like a good idea, but unfortunately, Weston proved to be less than honest. He went back on many of his promises to the Pilgrims. Preparations for the voyage were inadequate. Importantly, he now insisted that some non-Puritan adventurers join the expedition. It would no longer be the godly community that the Pilgrims were envisioning. And there were legal delays in forming the company, so the Pilgrims had no idea if they'd even have claims to the land or the fishing rights they'd hoped for. However, many of the Pilgrims had already sold off their belongings in preparation for the voyage, so there was little choice but to sail anyway. In the middle of 1620, they left the Netherlands for England. From there, 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, set off for America. But the Speedwell sprung a leak and had to return to England, so it was only the Mayflower that left Europe. The passengers on board the Mayflower were totally different from the adventurers who had sailed to Jamestown. For one thing, the Virginia colonists had all been male. Here, there were some families. 18 women, all married, and 30 children, although some children were there as servants. Of the 102 passengers, only 37 were proper Pilgrims, and a further 13 were servants working for the Pilgrims. That was just a sixth of the separatist group living in Holland. Not that many had been willing to come. The rest on board were merchants and adventurers. They were called the strangers by the Pilgrims, who, as I said, called themselves the saints. The two groups weren't totally hostile to each other, but there was a huge cultural divide, and it took constant work to keep them cooperating with each other. The Pilgrims had mostly been farmers back in England, but in the urban environment of the Netherlands they'd become small-scale artisans along with a few teachers, that kind of thing. No one of any particular social distinction or with much wealth. Neither were they particularly well-educated or well-read, unlike some of the more mainstream Puritans who'd emigrate later. Religion aside, they were quite average. Incidentally, one of the sailors on the Mayflower had also been on the Sea Venture when it was wrecked off Bermuda, and he'd then lived in Jamestown for 2 years. I should have mentioned this back in episode 2, but by the way, the wreck of the Sea Venture was believed to have been the inspiration for Shakespeare's play The Tempest. The voyage of the Mayflower was also miserable and storm-ridden. Thanks to all the delays, they had left it dangerously late in the year. A crewman and a passenger died at sea, but a child named Oceanus was born as well. The colonists had originally planned to settle along the Hudson River in what is now New York. That land was claimed by both the English and the Dutch. But the delays in Europe and the stormy weather had conspired to slow their progress, and now time was running out. They were low on provisions and scurvy was setting in. So the Mayflower just headed straight for the American coast as fast as possible. Instead of the Hudson, they arrived at Cape Cod, the long arc of land that juts out of Massachusetts. It was November 9th, 1620. They were 200 miles away from where they'd meant to be. They then tried to push on to their destination for 2 days, but failed, so Cape Cod it was. Now, this wasn't a disaster. Cape Cod was a reasonable enough place to settle, one that had been considered by the Pilgrims. But it did mean that the colonists were now outside the land that had been granted to them. None of the agreements that had been made for the running of the colony necessarily applied outside of that grant. That suited some of the strangers just fine. They would have been happy to do their own thing and not have to cooperate with a bunch of fanatics. But disunion increased the odds that the colony would fail, which would make everyone worse off. Thankfully for the settlers, cooler heads prevailed. The men of the Mayflower hammered out an agreement on how their colony was to be ruled and signed it on November 11th. They also elected a governor to rule them, John Carver, one of the wealthier saints. As you heard at the beginning of the episode, the Mayflower Compact was a simple document. It wasn't a constitution, just an agreement to form a government as they saw best in the future, while still remaining loyal to the king. But still, along with the creation of Virginia's General Assembly the year before, this is as reasonable a starting point for American self-government as any. Obviously, the Mayflower Compact has assumed a prominent place in American mythology, but at the time and for a century and a half to come, it was little more than a historical footnote. Survival was more important to the Pilgrims than anything else, and later on the Puritans in Massachusetts were seen as the real founders of New England. But by the time the American Revolution began, Americans, now flush with the rationalism of the Enlightenment, began to see value in the Compact. They themselves were trying to form a new government out of mutual consent, and the Mayflower Compact was a quite useful precedent. It was one of the purest examples of a social contract, of a people explicitly coming together to bind themselves in a government for their mutual benefit. In fact, it predated the most important theorists of the social contract by decades or more. Rousseau's book, called The Social Contract, naturally enough, wasn't published until 1762. So the Mayflower Compact was a useful American version of an idea that was very much in vogue at the time. Of course, you had to ignore the fact that the compact wasn't a social contract to ensure liberty, but rather a social contract to ensure conformity. The separatists, who were a minority on the Mayflower, were ensuring their control over the colony, not really following any high-minded ideals. The Pilgrims weren't the only ones to draft a compact, though. As we'll see in later episodes, a number of other colonies in New England formed themselves into governments in a similar manner. Clearly, notions of self-government were in the air among the Puritans, even from a very early date, undoubtedly thanks to their ideas of how churches were to be formed by mutual agreement. According to John Winthrop, who became governor of Massachusetts in the 1630s, quote, "It is clearly agreed by all that the care of safety and welfare was the original cause or occasion of commonweals, and of many families subjecting themselves to rulers and laws. For no man hath lawful power over another but by birth or consent." So the Mayflower Compact came first, but it wasn't unique, and it wasn't the real source of future American democracy. But still, it's a good story. With the creation of a government agreed to, the colonists finally disembarked after months at sea. The site they landed on had been named New Plymouth by John Smith, and so the settlement would come to be known as Plymouth Colony. After a month spent exploring the region in snow and in rain, the colonists settled on a site to build their first town and got to work constructing buildings. The area was littered with human bones. Massachusetts had been devastated by newly arrived European diseases just a few years ago, reducing the total population by up to 90%. There had been too few people left to bury the dead. Although European diseases had finally reached New England, the actual European presence there was still minimal. The area had been occasionally visited by ships sailing up and down the coast, but that was about it. Sometimes they stopped to trade with the natives, but sometimes they stopped to capture slaves, so relations between the Indians and the Europeans could be volatile and violent. New England was divided between a large number of tribes, enmeshed in an ever-shifting network of alliances. Sometimes a leader could unite a large number of tribes into a confederation, but these were short-lived. Also, by the way, women could occasionally become chiefs of their tribes. The peoples of the region spoke Algonquian languages, related to what the Powhatan of the Chesapeake spoke. The Plymouth settlers had a few hostile but inconclusive encounters with the Indians those first few months. Nothing as bad as what had happened in Jamestown early on, at least. But although violence was less of a concern, death was as much a constant in New England as in Virginia that first year. Disease and malnutrition had begun to hit the colonists even before they reached America, and the situation hadn't improved. One by one, the colonists died off. Only half survived the winter. They were already down to 50 people, some of them women and children. Plymouth could hardly have been more vulnerable. That March, they finally made proper contact with the Indians living in the region. A few of them spoke some English, and one, the famous Squanto, had even lived in Europe. Squanto had been abducted from his home during one of John Smith's explorations of the coast 6 years before and taken across the Atlantic. He eventually made it back to Massachusetts only to discover that his people had been wiped out by plague. Now, he was serving as interpreter to the local chieftain, Massasoit. Squanto encouraged the chief to make peace with the New English settlers, perhaps to strengthen his own position. He was successful. A peace treaty was agreed to, and Squanto remained with the English. He began teaching the Pilgrims how to grow crops that would thrive in New England's soil. At least in relations with the Indians, Plymouth was outperforming Jamestown. That spring, Governor Carver died suddenly and was replaced by William Bradford, who would remain as governor for 30 of the next 35 years. This was an elected position. In fact, for a while in Plymouth, the only elected positions were that of the governor and a few assistants to the governor, who served in part as an advisory council. In a colony with only one settlement and a few dozen subjects, you really didn't need anything more elaborate than that. Elections would have been very simple affairs, probably no different from other meetings of the colonists in some smoke-filled cabin. There were only a few dozen freemen eligible to vote, and not many things to vote on. And elections were mostly a formality at this point, as shown by the fact that the same man was governor for 3 decades. Elections served to affirm his power more than to gauge the will of the people. And the governor was indeed powerful. Most decisions were made by him and him alone. The governor could assemble the men of the colony to discuss important issues, but he rarely did so. It wasn't a dictatorship, but one man was calling the shots. But honestly, given the state of the colony, it's kind of impressive that they kept up elections at all. In June, the colonists finally received proper rights to their land. Due to the legal setup, this enabled them to pass rules to regulate themselves, but it didn't actually give the colony the right to set up its own government the way that Virginia or Maryland could. The Plymouth colonists would try to get a more proper charter repeatedly, but they always failed, and so their government always rested on shaky legal ground. Basically, the colonists had the right to be there, and the right to generally manage their own affairs, but not to fully govern themselves in the sense of passing laws and so on. But that was a slight distinction, and in practice the colony was as self-governing as any other. That fall, around harvest time, the Pilgrims and their native allies celebrated the first Thanksgiving, as American school children have heard about for generations. Even though half of them were dead, they did have a lot to be thankful for. Given all the problems their expedition faced, that any survived at all was a miracle. And thanks to their successful peace treaty with Massasoit, Plymouth would avoid the repeated disasters that befell Jamestown. More colonists arrived in November, again a mix of a few dozen saints and strangers. Over the next few years, Plymouth colonies struggled mightily to stay alive. They were always short on food, always at odds with their financial backers in England, and always at risk of being drawn into the conflicts of the various Indian tribes in the region. News of the 1622 massacre at Jamestown inspired the colonists to build a fort for self-defense. Squanto died that year as well. I won't trouble you with all of the details of the next few years. If you're interested in reading more, you should check out the book Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick, which I drew on heavily for this episode. But basically, tensions in the region between the various tribes have been growing for several years, in part thanks to the arrival of the English. When the Pilgrims learned of a potential plot to kill them and destroy their settlement, they took preemptive action and massacred a number of prominent members of the enemy tribe in question. This threw the whole balance of power in the region into chaos. Their ally Massasoit had previously only been chief of a smaller tribe in the region, but he took advantage of the instability and his English alliance to greatly expand his power and craft a confederation known as the Wampanoag. This put the Pilgrims in a pretty strong position, since they now had a powerful ally. Over the next few years, more ships arrived, although the colony remained very small, numbering only 300 in 1630. There were always money problems. The colony didn't prove very profitable, and the Pilgrims wound up buying out their investors back in England. A few other outposts were established in the region, but these were headed by irreligious adventurers who frequently found themselves at odds with the Pilgrims. Under these circumstances, the Saints never really mellowed out. They were able and willing to use violence to defend their way of life against anyone who threatened it. But their brief reign of influence in New England would soon be at an end. Only a decade after the founding of Plymouth, tens of thousands of Puritans began sailing to Massachusetts. While the Pilgrims hold an important place in American mythology, they didn't lay the real foundation for settlement in New England. They were, in a sense, a false start, like those first years at Jamestown. In the end, the Pilgrims were totally absorbed by the Puritans, and Plymouth just became part of Massachusetts. But, nevertheless, in those early years and in those early actions, we can see in miniature some of the divides between North and South that would persist across centuries of American history. The openness of the Mayflower Compact relative to the martial law of Virginia is striking. And the Pilgrims did have an impact on future American history. 8 presidents were descended from Mayflower colonists, including John Adams and John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, Franklin Roosevelt, and both Bushes. That's quite a legacy, all told, for a few hundred poor, persecuted people living on the fringe of the known world. However, next week we'll be moving on from Plymouth to discuss that much larger migration of Puritans and the government they set up in Massachusetts. So join me next time on Early and Often for the story of the pig who invented bicameralism. And if you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode at the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.